Welcome to episode 227 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the most complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. Each week we walk you through the Epicurean text and we discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at epicureanfriends.com. where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. We're now discussing the Epicurean sections of Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods. Last week we went through the opening sections here where Cicero described why he was writing this and basically how important this issue is for many reasons, but certainly from Cicero's point of view, one of them being that if you don't have the gods to tell you what to do, to give you instructions on how to live, or to threaten punishment for bad behavior and offer reward for good behavior, then you're likely to have a society that careens totally out of control and is totally immoral and dog against dog, all those things that people suggest would be the case without their particular expertise to guide the common people towards what they think is a more preferable way of life. And in regard to the importance of this question, one thing that came to my attention just yesterday as we were getting ready for this podcast is we have a new participant on the Epicurean Friends Forum who pointed out that she had seen a chart of comparison between Epicureanism and Stoicism that had been prepared by a Stoic. And we're going to post a copy of that chart in the thread that we have today. And a pattern that we often see is that Epicureanism as presented on the internet is often Epicureanism through Stoic eyes, or Epicureanism through Buddhist eyes. And without being overly critical of them and their perspectives, it's natural that they are going to see things in Epicureanism that in many cases are not there, but which they think they are identifying from their own perspective. And in the case of this chart, the chart is divided into virtues, pleasures, the gods, and superstition and divination. It's worth commenting that high-level summaries in charts like this can be deceptive and incomplete in the best of circumstances. But when they're prepared from another perspective, there can be particularly a problem. In this chart, as to the gods, the Epicurean entry says, don't impact our lives, ignore them. And the Stoic entry says, do impact our lives, honor and revere them. And the first comment I'd make is as to the Stoic that underplays the situation, because the Stoics, as we're going to be discussing, are taking the position that not only do the gods impact our lives, but they basically dictate everything that happens to us. And as a result of seeing everything happening to us as being generated by the gods, the Stoic view is that we should honor and revere the gods and just basically accept our fate and live with it. But when the Epicurean entry here says, in summary, they don't impact our lives and that we should ignore the gods, that's a particularly inadequate and inappropriate and just simply erroneous summary of the Epicurean position on the gods, as we're going to see Velleius go through. Now, while the gods don't control our lives, while they don't intervene in our lives, and that's a legitimate usage of the word impact, the gods do serve a very important function in Epicurean philosophy. And in terms of ignoring them, we're about to spend weeks and weeks going through what Velleius is going to have to say about the gods, and ignoring them and ignoring the topic is exactly not what Velleius is about to do. We're going to postpone the discussion of the constant issue of whether the Epicureans thought that the gods had a real flesh and blood atomic existence in some part of the universe, as appears to be the case, given what Velleius is going to tell us and what we have from other sources, including Philodemus, or whether the Epicurean position is that these are sort of thought constructs, that the gods exist as mental pictures that are generated within humans. And as I say, we're going to postpone in detail that discussion. We're definitely going to have it. But under either scenario, whether they are actual atomic beings in some corner of the universe or whether they are mental constructs by human beings, the gods are a subject which definitely do have impact in our lives. And the gods as a subject are certainly something that you're not supposed to ignore as a subject. Again, we taught last week that the very first principal doctrine is devoted to a discussion of an important aspect of the gods. Epicurus' letter to Menorchius begins with important instructions about what to think about the gods. The gods are covered in Lucretius. The gods are discussed in Diogenes of Oinoander. The gods are discussed at length in numbers of texts by Philodemus. So it is not a subject to be ignored, and it is not a subject to think does not impact our lives. So once again, the danger of looking at Epicureanism through Stoic or Buddhist eyes is that because Epicurus took a different view of the control that the gods have over humanity, that does not mean that Epicurus doesn't have a lot to say about what he thinks the nature of the gods really is. And again, that's what we're going to be seeing as we go through on the nature of the gods. The fourth category that this chart mentions is superstition and divination. Now, this chart, if you take it at face value, says that those subjects are false and to be avoided, and that that's exactly the same attitude that the Epicureans took and the Stoics as well took. I would suggest at the very least that the Epicurean view of superstition and divination is not simply that those things are false. The Epicurean view of divination, of predicting the future and being superstitious about things. Lucretius, for example, says, call upon Neptune if you like, if you want to use figures of speech to call upon the gods, but don't ever believe that the gods are really involved in your life. Another example would be Lucian, with a lot of statements Lucian makes throughout many of his dialogues, but in particular, Alexander the oracle monger. The words superstition and divination can be hard to define, and different people are going to consider different things to be superstition. But at least for the moment, the point I would like to stress is that I don't think Epicurus would have said that they are simply false. They are detrimental to happiness. The whole idea of believing that the gods are intervening in the world and that we have some connection to them, the ability to predict what they are going to tell us to do, predict what they're going to do themselves, that's just not something that's false and to be avoided. That is something that is the number one key problem in the corruption of the world and the inability to live a happy life from Epicurus' point of view. And as Lucretius says very early in Book 1, the priests and the poets are spinning these tales about hell and the threats that you face and the rewards that you might get because they're trying to manipulate you. And the way out of that manipulation is to understand that these things are impossible and cannot possibly be true. This is an example of common perceptions about Epicurean views towards religion that actually are very harmful in keeping people away from understanding what the Epicureans were really going towards. If you simply stop and think, don't fear the gods, and that's all you need to know about the gods, then you're going to be missing a tremendous amount of important Epicurean philosophy that is very helpful to place all of the philosophy within one single big picture if you dive into the details of it.
So what I'm hearing from you, Cassius, is that this is one extreme of how people have approached this question, to just push it off so remotely that it is of absolutely no importance to the philosophy. And you've, I think, stated the case that this is probably actually unproductive and even misleading as to the actual thoughts of Epicurus and his followers on the issue of the gods. Why did they write about it so much if it was of absolutely no importance? But there is another extreme to this problem, and it's an extreme that I see here in the introduction to John Mason Good's 1805 blank verse translation of Lucretius. And he manages to get it very, very wrong on what they had to say about the gods. So let's talk about that for just a minute to kind of set the outer limits of where people go wildly wrong here. So I'm going to quote from his Life of Lucretius, which is like 30 pages long. Nobody knows enough about Lucretius' life to publish a 30-page biography. And unfortunately, about 95% of this appears to me to be outright fiction. And I will post a link to this. This is on archive.org. And I am quoting from Roman numeral L. And I'm going to start around page 65. He says, "But the Epicureans, it may be said, were atheists. They denied the existence of a god and of a future state. And some parts of the poem of Lucretius are expressly written to establish such denial. let us examine these assertions separately. If, in the first place, it be atheism to deny the existence of those absurd and vicious deities who were the sole objects of adoration with the multitude, the Epicureans were certainly guilty of atheism, for such they did deny. But it is so far from being provable that they uniformly disbelieved the existence of an eternal first cause of all things, that it is perhaps impossible to produce an Epicurean philosopher of any age against whom such a charge can be legitimately substantiated. The philosophers of this school, on the contrary, have at all times as openly avowed the existence of such a deity, and in many instances as strenuously contended for the truth of such an avowal as the disciples of any system whatsoever. Such in the 17th century were Gassendi and Cudworth, whose physics are altogether founded upon the atomic hypothesis. Such was Abelard in the 12th, Alexander, who was a contemporary with Plutarch in the 1st century, and such was Epicurus himself. Thus, in the opening of a letter addressed to a favorite disciple, he quotes this: "Believe before all things," that's in italics, "that God is an immortal and blessed being, as indeed common sense should teach us concerning God. Conceive nothing of him that is repugnant to blessedness and immortality, and admit everything that is consistent with these perfections. The belief of Epicurus is indeed acknowledged by ancient writers in general. Cicero expressly tells us that he was punctilious in the discharge of his religious duties, and Seneca that he worshipped God on account of his most excellent majesty and supreme nature alone, without any idea either of future reward or future punishment." And then it gets really confusing. John Mason Good says this. He says, Epicurus admitted, moreover, the existence of orders of intelligences possessed of superior powers to the human race, whom, like the angels and archangels of the Christian system, he conceived to be immortal from their nature, to have been created anterior to the formation of the world, to be endowed with far ampler faculties of enjoyment than mankind, to be formed of far purer materials, and to exist in far happier abodes. The chief difference which I have been able to discern between the immortal spirits of the Epicurean system and of the Christian theologist is that while the latter are supposed to take an active part in the divine government of the world, the former are represented as having no kind of connection with it, since it was conceived by Epicurus that such an interference is absolutely beyond their power and would be totally subversive of their beatitude. This reminds me of a game that children sometimes play, which is, I think, called telephone. There's different names for this game, but when you have a bunch of people sitting in a circle and the teacher whispers in the ear of the first kid the sentence, and then they whisper it in the ear of the next kid, by the time you get to the end, maybe there are elements of it that ring true to the original sentence, but it's become so divergent from what was actually said that while it sounds similar, it's actually completely wrong. And that's John Mason Good's introduction to Lucretius. While he talks about some of the things that the Epicureans really did talk about, that the gods exist removed from human affairs, that they are immortal or incorruptible, and that the common understanding of the gods, of the multitude, is a false understanding, John Mason Good manages to get almost everything important wrong when he says, yes, there is a first cause, that there was a creator, that the gods that Epicurus describes as living removed from human affairs are actually created beings, created by this first cause God, and that they are similar to the angels and archangels of Christianity. This is about as bad as I've ever seen in terms of getting this profoundly wrong. So that sets up for us, I think, the two extremes here that we're going to avoid as we work our way through this series. We're going to avoid the extreme that says the gods are so far removed and they have no effect on us that they're completely unimportant to the philosophy and they mean nothing. And then on the other side, you have this view, which is, well, Epicurus was saying that there is a prime mover and a first cause after all, and that the gods he's talking about that are removed from the world are actually the angels and archangels of the first cause. So that sets up the course that we need to navigate as we go through this series.
Yeah, that's a great example, Joshua. You can get a grain of truth and focus on a piece of the picture and sound like you're being accurate, but by not processing the full picture and keeping the focus on the full picture, you end up with something that's extremely off base. And probably before we move on and make no further mention of this chart that we're going to have in the episode today, let me comment just quickly on how that process works in this chart on the other two categories. The first category listed of virtues says that the Epicureans held that virtues are useful but are not goods, and contrast that with the Stoics, who said that virtues are the highest good and that virtues are their own reward. As usual, it seems like the Stoics can get their own doctrine fairly accurate. They don't have a problem stating their own position. But in terms of the Epicurean position as to virtues, the implication of saying that they're useful but not goods, I think, is unfair to the emphasis that Epicurus did place on virtue, that you cannot live happily without being virtuous. And if you're virtuous, you can't help but be happy, because it's in a framework of understanding that virtue is not an end in itself, but only pleasure is an end in itself. And while that means that virtue should not be pursued for the sake of virtue, it means that there are, as a human being, certain essential things that you have to do with your life, almost the same as breathing and eating and drinking. And if you do not understand and practice the wisdom of acting in particular ways, then you're not going to be successful in achieving pleasure. So Epicurus does not consider virtues not to be extremely important, as this summary might imply, but he has an important perspective on virtue that his opponents often leave totally out of the picture. The same thing with pleasures. In this chart, which is elaborated on in the presentation that goes along with the chart itself says that Epicurus held that pleasure is the highest good and what we should seek in life. And it contrasts him with the Stoics, who say that pleasures are preferred indifference and not essential for a good life. Now, I'm not a Stoic, and I'm not going to represent that I know every citation that the Stoics have given, but to me, even that Stoic designation seems a little watered down, because I've never seen any of the ancient Stoics say great things about pleasure at all. And rather than saying that pleasures are not essential for a good life, when I look back and read what those Stoics are saying, it looks to me like they're saying that any kind of focus on pleasure or pursuit of pleasure is going to be detrimental to your pursuit of good life, because in fact, they are consistent that the only thing that's worth pursuing is virtue from the Stoic perspective. But as to the Epicurean summary that this chart gives, that pleasure is the highest good and that we should seek it in life, you've got the problem that you just mentioned, Joshua, that there's a grain of truth in that, but it is by far not the whole picture, because you must first understand what the category designation of pleasure really means. And the presentation that goes along with this chart falls victim to the predominant problem in outsiders reading Epicurean philosophy, that they consider pleasure to be only the stimulations of the senses, and they do not understand and they do not explain, in talking about Epicurus, that Epicurus held that all activities of life which are not painful are pleasurable. And that when Epicurus talked about absence of pain, he didn't mean some new category of experience that's different from pain and pleasure, because the point these guys never explain is that Epicurus held that there are only two feelings, pleasure and pain. And so absence of pain, when Epicurus uses that term, is the exact same thing as pleasure. It is not a different experience that is somehow more important than pleasure itself. Epicurus can be as logically precise as any Stoic ever was. And when you have only two experiences, pleasure and pain, when you're not experiencing pain, you are experiencing pleasure, full stop. And that means that pleasure is not just these stimulations, but is a much wider category of everything in life that is not painful. And that category of everything in life that is not painful includes all of the literature and art and philosophy and good feeling and every experience that we find agreeable in life that people want to say, well, you're talking about things that are noble and worthy, and so those can't be pleasure, which of course is a ridiculous way of looking at it, because if you don't get some benefit out of an experience, then why would you ever do it? And Epicurus considers these experiences that are agreeable to us, beneficial to us, as pleasure, regardless of whether they involve sex, drugs, and rock and roll or not. So again, the point for today is that if you gloss over important differences, if you pick out one section of a statement, for example, as John Mason Good is doing there, he's certainly correct that Epicurus had a lot to say about how important it is to believe in the gods. But you've got to be clear about what type of gods Epicurus is talking about, and not imply that the gods Epicurus is talking about have anything to do with the god of the Stoics or the god of Plato or the god of Judeo-Christianity or any other religion that you want to talk about. You've got to drill down and get Epicurus's own definition of these terms, or you're just going to butcher the whole process.
Yeah, and if people go back to episode 201, that's a really good episode where we talk about this issue of how there are only two feelings, pleasure and pain, how absence of pain is pleasure and so forth. So that's a good episode on that point. That's from our series on Book 2 of Cicero's On Ends.
Yes. And so now to get to the new material in section 7, let's first discuss the opening of the scene here. Cicero's told us that he'd gotten together with his friend Cotta, and there was a discussion going on between Cotta and Velleius about the nature of the gods. And then we get to section 7, which says this. This is Cicero speaking. Indeed, said I think I've come very seasonably, as you say, for here are 3 chiefs of the 3 principal sects met together. If Marcus Piso was present, no sect of philosophy that is in any esteem would want an advocate. And then, if Antiochus's book, replied Cotta, which he lately sent to Balbus, is true, you have no occasion to wish for your friend Piso, for Antiochus is of the opinion that the Stoics do not differ from the Peripatetics in fact, although they do in words. And I should be glad to know what you think of that book, Balbus. I, said Balbus, I wonder that Antiochus, a man of the clearest apprehension, should not see what a vast difference there is between the Stoics, who distinguish the honest and the profitable not only in name, but absolutely in kind, and the Peripatetics, who blend the honest with the profitable in such a manner that they differ only in degrees and proportion and not in kind. This is not a little difference in words, but a great one in things. So here's the setting that we should probably talk about for minutes to be clear as we go through this series about who the speakers are. We've got Velleius, who is going to be the Epicurean spokesman. We've got Cicero, who is going to represent the academics. Now, as usual with Cicero, he's kind of hard to pin down on whether to consider him sympathetic to the Stoics or whatever. But for purposes of this discussion, he's largely representing the academic school. And then we have Lucius Balbus, who is representing the Stoics. And we were talking before the episode got started today. There's a reference here to Marcus Piso that we should be clear about, because there's a Lucius Piso who was Julius Caesar's father-in-law and the apparent owner of the Villa of the Papyri in Herculaneum, who would definitely have been an Epicurean. And this is not that person that's being referred to, but another Piso by the name of Marcus Piso. And Wikipedia contains some interesting information on him, and don't know whether this relates to why he's not there at this discussion or not. But Wikipedia says, talking about Piso, in his consulship, Piso gave great offense to Cicero by not asking him first in the Senate for his opinion, and then further increased the anger of Cicero by taking Publius Clodius under his protection after his violation of the mysteries of the Bona Dea. Cicero revenged himself on Piso by preventing him from obtaining the province of Syria, which had been promised to him. So reading between the lines here, it sounds like that Cicero, by the time he's writing this book, might not have been exactly the biggest fan of Marcus Piso. Now, whether that plays into why he's not present representing the Peripatetics, hard to say. But at least we know that this conversation is going to be carried on mainly between the Stoics, the Epicureans, and then the academics.
This is a bit of a sidebar, but I looked up this goddess, Bona Dea, which of course means good goddess, and what her association was in ancient Rome. And she was associated with chastity and fertility among married Roman women, with healing, with the protection of the state and the people of Rome. And her rites allowed women the use of strong wine and blood sacrifice, things otherwise forbidden them by Roman tradition. Men were barred from some of her mysteries, and only initiates were given the possession of her true name. Given that male authors had limited knowledge of her rights and attributes, ancient speculations about her identity abound, among them that she was an aspect of Terra, Ops, Cybele, Ceres, or a Latin form of a Greek goddess Damia, or possibly Demeter. Most often she was identified as the wife, sister, or daughter of the god Faunus, thus an equivalent or aspect of the fertility nature goddess Fauna, who could prophesy the fates of women. These mystery cults in the ancient world were quite common. Among the Greeks, you had the Eleusinian mysteries, which I think were sacred to Demeter, but I'm not sure. But Epicurus himself was said to have been initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries. So this was a very important cultural practice for the ancients. And apparently Marcus Piso gave his protection to Publius Claudius after his violation of these mysteries. And Cicero apparently took this to heart.
Yeah, and so to be clear on who's representing who, Gaius Cotta, at whose villa this is taking place, is an academic skeptic himself, just like Cicero. Now, Cicero in this dialogue, I think, is going to claim that he's neutral and not taking sides, but it appears that Gaius Cotta is being used in the dialogue as the main representative of the academic school. So we can expect Cotta and Cicero to largely be in agreement. But this last comment is one in which Cotta is pointing out that there's disagreement even among the academic skeptics as to whether the Peripatetics really have the same position about the gods as the Stoics do. And so the next thing it said is, now, if you think fit, let us return to what we began with. With all my heart, said Cotta, but that this visitor looking at me, Cicero, who has just come in, may not be ignorant of what we are upon, I will inform him that we were discoursing on the nature of the gods, concerning which, as it is a subject that always appeared to be very obscure to me, I prevailed on Velleius to give us the sentiments of Epicurus. Therefore, continued he, if it is not troublesome, Velleius, repeat what you have already stated to us. I will, said Velleius, though this newcomer will be no advocate for me, but for you. For you have both, added he with a smile, learned from the same Philo to be certain of nothing. What we have learned from him, replied I, Cotta will discover. But I would not have you think that I am come as an assistant to him, but as an auditor, with an impartial and unbiased mind, and not bound by any obligation to defend any particular principle, whether I like it or dislike it. So there we have Cicero claiming to be the neutral arbiter, who's not partial or biased in any way. No, not Cicero. And he's not bound by any obligation to defend any principle. He's going to be absolutely neutral, supposedly, in this conversation.
Yes. Now we have a new name here that was just mentioned, Philo. He was the last known head of Plato's Academy during its skeptical phase. Under his leadership, the academics abandoned the radical skepticism of Arcesilaus and Carneades, who professed to live without rationally warranted beliefs, in favor of a form of mitigated skepticism allowing for provisional beliefs that did not claim certainty. One of the things we're going to see all throughout this text is Cotta and Cicero saying things like, well, I only say that I think it is probable, not that it is certain, which is the whole academic skeptic approach to things.
Claiming that the only wisdom in life is to know that there is no wisdom in life, or things like that are just self-contradictory. And yet they're stated in a very urbane and dramatic and emotional and glorious manner that makes you think, well, obviously everybody should agree with this position, even while they're basically saying that nobody knows what's right and wrong. So agreeing or disagreeing itself is questionable. But that's what we have to learn to live with, as you said, Joshua, in reading the academic position as we go forward here. Okay, and so now we get to section 8, where we have the first statement by Velleius of any significance. Section 8, after this, Velleius, with the confidence peculiar to his sect, dreading nothing so much as to seem to doubt of anything, began as if he had just descended from the council of the gods and Epicurus's intervals of the worlds. Do not attend, said Velleius, to these idle and imaginary tales, nor to the operator and builder of the world, the god of Plato's Timaeus, nor to the old prophetic dame, the pronoia of the Stoics, which the Latins call Providence, nor to that round, burning, revolving deity, the world, endowed with sense and understanding, the prodigies and wonders, not of inquisitive philosophers, but of dreamers. Okay, there's a lot more to come there, but let's stop at that paragraph and go ahead and talk about several important aspects of it. First of all, Velleius, with the confidence peculiar to Epicureanism, of dreading nothing so much as to seem to be in doubt of anything, is a sarcasm of Cicero against the Epicureans that does have a lot of importance to it, in that Epicurus taught that certain things are knowable in life. In Diogenes Laertius, the word that everybody hates, dogmatism, is used, that Epicurus said that the wise man will dogmatize, that Epicurus said that the wise man will take a position on things that he's confident of and not waffle around and talk about, well, I don't know this, I don't know that, and act like Socrates or these academics are doing and claim that the only thing we can really know in life is that we know nothing. Epicurus took the opposite position, that at least on certain things, that if you've got enough evidence and you've thought them through long enough, you're going to be confident of your position, which, of course, confidence can be among the most irritating attributes of any person from the perspective of those people who say that nothing is certain in life at all. But Velleius is going to come at this just like an Epicurean would, charging through straight to the heart of it, much as Lucian is referring to different Epicureans and Aristotle, the oracle monger. He doesn't start out by saying, well, this is a very difficult subject, very hard to know all of these things, and very hard to understand all of the different opinions of the philosophers. And, Plato had some good ideas, but I think he went a little bit too far, and maybe Socrates had some good things, and he maybe went a little too far. Velleius does not come out and give credit to these positions that he's going to attack. He immediately goes on the attack, and he calls the positions of Plato, which everybody in Greece was supposed to hold in the highest respect, idle and imaginary tales. And he starts talking about Plato's Timaeus and the pronoia of the Stoics, which we could call providence or largely related to the fates and so forth, or people who would endow the world with sense and understanding. Velleius does not mince any words. He calls these ideas the prodigies and wonders, not of inquisitive philosophers, but of dreamers. The first words out of Velleius's mouth in discussing religion is that these guys who are taking the position that the gods made and control the world are dreamers. These are idle and imaginary tales.
Yeah, let me read this passage from Rackham, because I really like the way that he puts Cicero's little witticism here. Hereupon Velleius began, in the confident manner I need not say, that is customary with Epicureans, afraid of nothing so much as lest he should appear to have doubts about anything. One would have supposed he had just come down from the assembly of the gods in the intermundane spaces of Epicurus. And he goes on, I am not going to expound to you doctrines that are mere baseless figments of the imagination, such as the artisan deity and the world builder of Plato's Timaeus, or that old hag of a fortune teller, the pronoia, which we may render providence of the Stoics.
And he seems to have a way with words like that old hag of a fortune teller. That's creative. And calling them mere baseless figments of imagination. So we can probably usefully compare the different translations as we go through and get different ways of expressing the same points.
Exactly. Now I'm back to Young here, and he goes on, he says, for with what eyes of the mind was your Plato able to see that workhouse of such stupendous toil in which he makes the world to be modeled and built by God? What materials, what tools, what bars, what machines, what servants were employed in so vast a work? How could the air, fire, water, and earth pay obedience and submit to the will of the architect? From whence arose those 5 forms of which the rest are composed, so aptly contributing to frame the mind and produce the senses. It is tedious to go through all, as they are of such a sort, they look more like things to be desired than to be discovered. What he's saying here, interestingly, in the very last clause there, is that this is wishful thinking on the part of people like Plato, who are talking about these things. This is something more to be desired than to be discovered. It's not that he went out into nature, as Epicurus would have advised, and found these things to be true from a study of nature. It's that he wanted them to be true and believed them for that reason.
Yeah, Joshua, there we should include another of the constructions that Rackham used. To quote Rackham, he said, "These are the marvels and monstrosities of philosophers who do not reason but dream." So a lot of these accusations here come down to it's wishful thinking, you're dreaming, you're imagining these things, your gods don't exist, they're not doing the things that you say that they're doing, and it's madness, basically, to take the positions that you're taking. And as you just started reading, we're going to go through these criticisms that Velleius gives again immediately, right on the very beginning. Then start off by saying, well, Plato was a wonderful man who everyone in Greece reveres, but he made a couple of small mistakes. He doesn't water any of this down. He jumps right into the heart of the issue, and he levels attacks both at Plato's gods, at the Stoic conception of the god, and then attacks that apply to both. But his beginning attack is, what is your evidence for with what eyes of the mind was your Plato able to see that these things were taking place? And what materials and what tools were used in such vast a work? How could the air, fire, water, and earth pay obedience and submit to the will of the architect? So as we go through this, we're going to start to see the classic arguments that are familiar to many of us today among the free thinkers or different types of atheists over the years who've been attacking the modern conceptions of Judeo-Christianity and other modern religions. We see how deeply far back into the history of classical philosophy, history of the Western world, these attacks were stated. There's very little new under the sun with the different arguments we see in the very popular books that are out there today. Most of these arguments occurred to the ancients and were present before Christianity even developed because they're logical and they immediately come up to anybody who thinks about this instead of dreams.
Yeah, speaking of dreams, Cassius, let me read this passage from Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra. Cleopatra says, "I dreamt there was an Emperor Antony. Oh, such another sleep that I might see but such another man." Throughout this whole passage, there's a Roman soldier, Dolabella, who keeps interrupting her and trying to bring her back down to earth, but she won't listen. Cleopatra continues, "His face was as the heavens, and therein stuck a sun and a moon, which kept their course and lighted the little O, the earth. His legs bestrid the ocean, his reared arm crested the world. His voice was propertied as all the tuned spheres, and that to friends. But when he meant to quail and shake the orb, he was as rattling thunder. For his bounty there was no winter in it, and autumn it was that grew the more by reaping. His delights were dolphin-like, they showed his back above the element they lived in. In his livery walked crowns and crownets. Realms and islands were as plates dropped from his pocket. Think you there was or might be such a man as this I dreamt of?" And the Roman soldier says, "Gentle madam, no." And Cleopatra says, "You lie up to the hearing of the gods. But if there be, nor ever were one such, it's past the size of dreaming. Nature wants stuff to vie strange forms with fancy, yet to imagine an Antony were nature's peace against fancy, condemning shadows quite." So as a good example of wish thinking, we have this queen and pharaoh of Egypt who is remembering, I think Antony has died at this point, and Cleopatra is about to commit suicide at the end of the play there. I was interested to learn, though, that Dolabella in the story was Publius Cornelius Dolabella, who was consul in 44 BC, a Roman politician and general under the dictator Julius Caesar, arranged for himself to be adopted into a plebeian family so that he could become tribune of plebs. He married Cicero's daughter Tullia, although he frequently engaged in extramarital affairs. And throughout his entire life, he was an extreme profligate, something that Plutarch wrote reflected ill upon his patron Julius Caesar. I don't know if there's an Epicurean connection here or not, but Wikipedia doesn't mention any. But coming in there at the end and saying, Cleopatra, you're just dreaming. What you're describing isn't real, is sort of what Velleius is doing here in Cicero's work. This is idle wish thinking, and it has no relation to reality.
We've talked about a lot today that's going to be themes as we go forward, and it's probably a good time to drop back and make this comment again, that as we found in Own Ends, Cicero is not just inventing everything that's said here out of whole cloth, out of his own mind. In Own Ends, he was going to existing Epicurean works of his time and summarizing them into his work, just putting them into a dialogue form so that it's more interesting to read. And he's presumably doing the same thing here. So as Velleius goes from here to present the Epicurean position, I do think we ought to consider that the order and method of presentation of what we're hearing from Velleius is likely to be the well-developed Epicureanism of Cicero's day that he's picking up from Epicurean authorities. I say that to emphasize that Velleius, as the Epicureans would do, is laying everything out at the very beginning. And I don't want us to think that this discussion today, which is going to have to come to an end because of time before too much longer, is all we're going to be able to say about these arguments. Because what Velleius is really doing here is giving us at the beginning almost an outline of the Epicurean attack on this supernatural religion. And to repeat what Velleius is saying here, which we should probably consider to be that outline, his first attack is you have no evidence to see what you're claiming is going on. For with what eyes of the mind was your Plato able to see that workhouse of such stupendous toil? You didn't see this happen. You don't have evidence to support it. And so that's the first attack. Then you have these logical attacks after this absence of evidence attack by saying that Plato can't explain how God's created the universe. When we look around and see how the elements work and we see how materials work and so forth, there's no way that they're just going to spring to action on their own and carry out the will of the gods. So it simply doesn't make sense that the gods could have created a place like the universe. And then the third of the arguments that he mentions today, we're going to come back to all of these, is how could Plato's God have created an eternal universe? Velleius says, but what's more remarkable, Plato gives us a world which has not only been created, but if I may say so, in a matter formed with hands. And yet he says it's eternal. Do you conceive him to have the least skill in natural philosophy, who is capable of thinking anything to be everlasting that had a beginning? For what can possibly ever have been put together which cannot be dissolved again? Or what is there that had a beginning which will not have an end? So that's another logical argument here, that in our experience, things that are put together from other materials don't have an eternal existence. This section closes this way. Or what is there that had a beginning which will not have an end? If your providence, Lucilius, who is the Stoic, is the same as Plato's God, I ask you as before, who were the assistants? What were the engines? What was the plan and the preparation of the whole work? If it is not the same, then why did she make the world mortal and not everlasting like Plato's God? Now that's a reference probably to the Stoics' pronoia we were discussing, providence being referred to in the feminine. Why did she make the world mortal and not everlasting like Plato's God? So he's pointing out the split between the Stoics and the academics there, in that the Stoics apparently thought that the world will come to an end at some point, while the academics were saying that the world was eternal.
You know, Cassius, the language they're using here reminds me of a very famous moment in Homer's Iliad, actually, which is the moment that Hephaestus forges Achilles a new set of armor, and particularly the shield in particular, a widely praised work of poetry. I'm going to read a little bit of this, and we'll kind of compare it briefly to what we're seeing here. So Homer writes this way. He says, "Thus having said, the father of the fires to the black labors of his forge retires. Soon as he bade them blow, the bellows turned their iron mouths, and where the furnace burned, resounding breathed. At once the blast expires, and 20 forges catch at once the fires, just as the god directs. Now loud, now low, they raise a tempest, or they gently blow. In hissing flames, huge silver bars are rolled, and stubborn brass and tin and solid gold. Before deep fixed the eternal anvils stand, the ponderous hammer loads his better hand. His left with tongs turns the vexed metal round, and thick strong strokes the doubling vaults rebound. Then first he formed the immense and solid shield. Rich various artifice emblazed the field, its utmost verge a threefold circle bound. And he goes on and on like that. But one of the things that we see every time Hephaestus is mentioned is several of the things that are mentioned here, which is that he has automated assistants when he's working. And so looking at Velleius in the previous passage, when he describes the workhouse of the master builder God and the materials and the tools and the bars of metals and the machines and the servants working on his behalf, what this is, I think, is meant to call to mind is that passage from Homer's Iliad, which is the description of a great work made by Hephaestus with his automated servants and the forged bellows that answer to his voice and so forth. So as a kind of image of creation, this is pretty important because it happens in probably the seminal work of classical literature, which is the Iliad.
Yeah, it sure sounds like that they had something like that in mind when they were deciding what issues were the most important to discuss and how to attack them. So this section 8 introduces for us the argument that Velleius is going to present about the impossibility and illogic and unreason and all sorts of different, call them marvels and monstrosities of philosophers who do not reason but dream, all sorts of wishful thinking that's really at the basis of these supernatural religious theories, whether they are Platonic and therefore the academic school, or whether the Stoics try to modify them by talking about providence or not. Neither one of them makes any sense. Neither one of them has any evidence to support it. And both of them are positions that we simply don't want to take the position that, well, it doesn't make any difference. You can have your views and I can have mine, whatever. It's not a matter of saying that they don't impact our lives and that we should ignore them. These are things that an Epicurean is going to be confident about and rejecting. And it's going to take the position, no, these are not possibilities. These are not innocent speculations. These are things that do impact our lives in an extremely negative way. And they need to be rooted out and basically trampled underfoot, as Lucretius talks about in Book 1. And so with that discussion of Section 8, let's bring today's discussion to a conclusion. Any final thoughts today, Joshua?
Yeah, Cassius, let me just read the passage that you cited from the opening of Lucretius. This is the Rolfe Humphreys translation. He says, "When human life, all too conspicuous, lay foully groveling on earth, weighed down by grim religion looming from the skies, horribly threatening mortal men, a man, a Greek, first raised his mortal eyes bravely against this menace. No report of gods, no lightning flash, no thunder peal made this man cower, but drove him all the more with passionate manliness of mind and will to be the first to spring the tight-barred gates of nature's hold asunder." And of course, that passage ends with the very famous line, "Religion so is trampled underfoot, and by his victory we reach the stars." So we've covered a lot of ground today, but I hope people begin to see the outline of the conversation here, that there are a lot of false turns that you can take when you go down this path. You can take the view of John Mason Good, that the Epicureans were basically Platonists the whole time, or you can take the view of Cicero and the academics, that really knowledge about any of this stuff is impossible, because knowledge generally is impossible. This is the Pyrrhonist skeptical position. You can take the view that the Epicureans were outright atheists and that any discussion of the gods is irrelevant and impertinent to the conversation. But what they had to say, they said a lot. I mean, they talked about the gods in most of their texts, and they talked about them in texts that we don't even have anymore. So there's a whole wealth of information and context that's important to the conversation here. And if we just ignore it all, this is a huge hole in the philosophy, as in some sense, as I said, the texts are missing. So it's a huge hole in what survives. And so that's why this book is important in giving context to the broader story. Pretending that it doesn't matter, I think, is the wrong course when it comes to talking about this stuff.
And that's why simply trying to summarize everything about the gods by saying that you should not fear the gods is grossly insufficient to understand where the Epicureans were really coming from. And that's our goal here, is to go into the details, the real heart of Epicurean philosophy, and bring it to people so that they can decide whether they agree with it and want to apply it to their lives. And then when they understand truly what Epicurus is saying, they'll be in a position to make that judgment with accuracy and not just on a superficial, glossed over basis. That's where we'll end it for today. As always, we invite you to drop by the Epicurean Friends Forum and let us know if you have any comments or questions about this or any of our other episodes. Thanks for your time today. We'll be back next week. Bye.